welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. This is Jessica. I am your host, and I am here with the author of this really cool, twisty book that actually does one of my favorite things. It plays with mediums, which I feel like is just a really interesting storytelling method. You switch between scripts and then the dialogue of what's going on. Super fun. The book is called The Scenes of the Crime. And what's your name?
I am Jilly Gagnon, which is a very illogical pronunciation of my name. So it looks like Gagnon.
I'm really glad that I quote unquote introduced you that way because
Right.
I'm as somebody whose name frequently gets mangled. I would have hated to be on the other end of that.
I'm used to, after a lifetime, I'm from Minnesota too. So having a somewhat Frenchy last name, it's even more mangled in the Midwest. I think that's how we ended up with Gagnon as opposed to a somewhere explicable pronunciation of my name. So I'm very glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. So let's talk about the scenes of the crime, which is really interesting. So basically, it's the story of Emily and her friend Vanessa, who is gone, by the beginning of the book. And Emily works as a script writer, which kind of comes into the story. And when Vanessa died, it was years ago. She was on this trip with her friends to this winery, which belongs to Vanessa and belongs to Vanessa's grandparents, I guess.
Yes.
So she was there with her cousin, and everybody had a bit of a secret. Everyone's friend dynamic was different, and then Vanessa's not there anymore. So they are all returning to the scenes of the crime. They all have their own history with what happened and things that have happened since, and Emily really wants to find out what happened and if she was involved, if she is a culprit in one way or the other. So talk a little bit about this book. Talk a little bit about where the story sort of came from and like how each character kind of played out in your mind.
Yeah. So I think the book, the core of it that you kind of were hinting at with that is that like these toxic friendships between all of these women, and much more toxic back in the day, they've drifted. Vanessa was kind of the nucleus of this group. And without her, they've all kind of drifted into different directions. But when they get back together, sort of like I have sisters, and when we all get under my mom's roof again at the holidays, it's like we revert to our old selves. When they all get back together in the place that this horrible thing happened, it's like they revert to these versions of themselves that haven't necessarily been true for a really long time. So you get to see that toxic dynamic playing out in the present and in the past. And I think that's something that as a female writer, the kind of the dynamic of female friendships and that borderline between what can be intimacy and seem like the best kinds of intimacy and can in fact be toxic is something that's really fascinating to me. I think that a lot of women have experienced at some point in their lives, looking back, perhaps realized that a friendship that they thought was nurturing was not. It was actually parasitic or some other version of toxic. So for me, I thought that was really an interesting germ at the center of the story, like the seed or whatever. And also, I love telling stories. When you talk about the multimedia, I love telling stories in a playful or a different way. And so I wanted to find a story and a way to access it that could make the classic, the thriller and mystery writer's favorite thing, an unreliable narration, sort of new. If the story is being told partially as a script, well, the scripted version is never going to be the same as reality. It can't be. You're trying to give it a story arc. It's what I do as a writer when I'm trying to give a book, bring it into existence in the first place. So the story within the story being shaped by one of the characters, I thought was a really interesting dynamic and would make it really hard to know what to trust. And Emily herself, as she is putting the script in between, what's going on, the events of the story, is sort of acknowledging, well, I'm not really sure if that's what would have happened. Maybe this is the version, and you see that playing out on the page. So all of that was really interesting. And then I really loved the idea of a story where the person that you are identifying with and coming to the story through really isn't sure of their own level of culpability. And they're not some bad guy. They're not the villain, but they don't know how much guilt they hold around this thing, which gives a whole nother layer of intrigue to why she needs to find these answers. So hopefully that answered the question. I'm very good, like every author, at going off on a tangent and then realizing I'm not sure I answered what you
No,
asked.
actually, that was perfect because that's kind of how I read it. And toxic friendships, man, this is going to sound so messed up. Toxic friendships in women books are one of my absolute favorite. I don't even want to call it a trope, but just sort of plot points, because and I think I've said this through certain just different chats that I've had with authors who've kind of explored this theme in different ways. I feel like, and I don't know if it's still like this because I'm obviously no longer in high school and I'm not in my 20s anymore, but I feel like that was sort of a given for a while. I mean, what this is like one of those messed up things my mom told me years ago, and I think about it now and I'm like, that's kind of messed up. But basically I remember kind of being taught that that's just how female friendships are. They'll throw you aside for a guy if something better comes along, just kind of accept that you're always in this competition with them,
Yes.
which I think is also sort of a standard when people talk about sister relationships to a degree. You're supposed to always be in competition. That's certainly what the fairy tales tell you. But I think that I hope that nowadays people are sort of looking at female friendships in a different way and not teaching that to their daughters. But I don't know. What I do know is that yes, you're right. There is sort of this thing that happens where you can look back on these friendships with these, like girls or women, and you kind of do realize that not only was that toxic or parasitic on their end, but also maybe you weren't the best version of yourself either. And I think that that really kind of comes into play here. Everybody has a very different view of Vanessa, and she seems very complicated. Her background is certainly complicated. She has this cousin, and I believe they were the only two, correct, of this
Yes.
wealthy set of grandparents. And Vanessa versus Brittany, Vanessa was sort of a pariah, and part of it was completely not her fault. It was a choice that her father made, which was certainly in poor taste. But it wasn't Vanessa's fault by any means. So, that was another thing. I really liked the examination of the relationship of that family. Did you sort of was Brittany and Vanessa as characters, were they sort of, did they pop up around the same time when you were writing the story?
Yeah, I think I tend to come up with story ideas, and it's like, this is like, I've come up with like a root idea and then I spend a lot of time with characters. And I think Vanessa and Brittany were necessary counterparts to each other that came to me for this story around the same time. Because what you're talking about, the way that women perpetuate generationally this toxic idea of femininity on daughters and siblings and cousins and friends, is tragic but true. There's a lot of things that you don't like, but it's a fact, and writing about them and exploring them it's because it's out there and we see it, right? And I agree with you. I hope I have very real hope that women who are coming up behind us maybe don't have the same quite as intensive a version of this, but this idea that other women are your competition at all times is it's really built into society, and it certainly was when I was growing up. And it's really, if you don't want to play that game, there's not a very easy way to opt out. You might find yourself thinking you're opting out, and in fact, you're just playing the game poorly, and someone else is playing the game against you as opposed to with you. So Brittany and Vanessa are sort of an encapsulation of that same game, but in a different space, in the family space. And, you know, Vanessa's grandmother is punishing her for the sins of her parents. And Brittany and Vanessa have a relationship where Brittany, in order to acknowledge what Vanessa's going through, would have to acknowledge that she's been given a lot of privilege, which nobody likes to do. The more privilege you have, I think often the harder it is to acknowledge the privilege you have. So putting them together at the sort of center of this group, it also helped me to understand how you might form a group where those alliances, they are really at cross purposes. And I was in female groups like this where you're friends with so-and-so and they're friends with so-and-so, but you don't like that third person and they don't like you back. However, you all hang out because, you know, there's this weird chess, like three-dimensional chess going on in all of these relationships. And Brittany and Vanessa being tied to each other despite themselves, they had to have a relationship, helped explain how you could get these mismatched pieces together. They're all orbiting the same central pull, but Brittany and Vanessa are both a part of it. They're like other halves of the nucleus. So like the most physics I can get into, by the way. I don't speak science really.
It worked really well. And then you have Lydia and Paige, who were kind of like, again, like that classic sort of mismatched a power struggle between friends too. You know, it was a really interesting group, and I really love this whole idea of getting them together when they're older and wiser and have been through more and have had careers, or you know, relationships or breakups. You know, I think that it's really because you do change a lot, and I think just the idea of having them back together in this space, sort of to acknowledge this thing that may or may not have happened the way that they think that it did, was just sort of interesting. Why in particular did you choose like that time frame removed from what happened with Vanessa?
I think, I mean, partly just sheer ability to understand that time frame. I'm in my late 30s now. So putting women in their late 30s, it's a place that I can understand the changes that have happened. If I had them much older, I would be guessing. I'm not sure how I'll continue to change, but I know how I've changed so far. So that was on a very logistical level, a huge part of it. I know where I am now versus where I was then. But additionally, I think that at least 10 plus years, I thought in my 20s that I was changing all the time and I was learning more about myself. And I probably would have told you at the end of my 20s that I was able to, you know, completely analyze myself in this way. And the fact is, growing into my confidence of who I am took place after that. It was a later process. Really being confident in the person I am now and feeling like a fully formed version of myself took place later than that. And I wanted all of these women to have reached the point in their lives where, for better or worse, some of them might still have weird dependencies, interdependencies, all of those things, but they're formed. The version of them that is going to go through the adult world and move through the adult world and be taken seriously as an adult has been formed by each other and also the rest of their experiences. So then when you put them back together and they do in some ways fall back into this rhythm, there's that friction of like, yeah, but I'm not that person anymore. And you don't get to talk to me that way anymore. And I'm not going to say what you want me to say. And you're not going to think what I expect you to think. It gives it like any way that I can put friction into a scene without having to create it from the outside in, I love. So giving them this amount of remove makes their relationships just full of just sandpaper already. They're always going to be rubbing up against each other in a way that is unavoidable, which I love as an author.
I like it as a reader too. It feels very tense and real. And I think I like, you know, that you can really build this feeling of dread and this feeling of suspense without it actually being like, like action suspense. There's a lot of action in words. There's a lot of action in how people interact is very tense. What kind of books did you enjoy reading before you became a writer? Were you like a thriller mystery reader yourself?
I mean, yeah, off and on through the years, I'll go through phases where I remember when I was like 9, way too early for this, but I read like all of the Sue Grafton mysteries, and then I read all of Mary Higgins Clark's mysteries, and all, back then that's what you could find, and you could go through, you could just devour them if you were that
Yeah,
kind of a
you
kid.
had like your grandmother's like shelf of Danielle Steele or Sue
Yes,
Grafton, right? Like
exactly,
that was pretty much it. It's like, you'd be like, okay, so I can either take this or I can take this. No
exactly.
shade to
Yeah,
either one.
yeah, no shade. Like only as a writer now, like I look at that and like, dang, you guys are like the productivity, and you kept coming like that is some churning that I am impressed by. But yeah, and I would go through that way back in the day, and then in the last like 8 or 10 years, I'd say I've been really deep in like the thriller space again, because I wanted to start writing them myself. um and I think that as a writer it's almost irresponsible not to spend some time reading the thing you want to write, because you don't want to steal from somebody else and not know it. There's stuff in the zeitgeist sometimes you don't want to just reproduce somebody else's story. And B, you want to see how people are doing it well. If I read a Lisa Jewell book, or I read, I mean, this is not exactly what I write, but like I love Tana French. I have read every single one of her books, and I learn so much as a writer by reading how she creates. And when you're talking about the suspense that isn't action, I would say Tana French books, the mystery at the center is almost incidental. It is all about characters being put into situations that they're uncomfortable and force them into places they don't want to be. And that's what we're really reading about. You're not really solving the crimes in a meaningful way. You are, but to me, the like what she does with character and the explorations of people and how they push off of one another and how they deal with trauma is much more what I take away from her books than the plots per se. So yeah, I've been reading in that space for a long time. And when you read a lot in a space, you start to recognize a lot of the things that get done over and over, and they can be done really well. It's not to say that I don't like them and don't appreciate them, but it also allows you to see what you might want to, like a way that you could be different. It's like if I want to create an unreliable narrator situation, I don't necessarily want to go to the well of alcohol for this one, although they are at a winery. But like that's something that happens a lot. It's been done really well. I enjoy it, but I want to do something new for readers.
Oh no,
So
I absolutely appreciated that very, very much.
yeah, it's one of those things that I think it is a really effective way to make your narrator second guess themselves, and that's why it's been done by other people better. And that's why I would like to do something different here. So finding those ways to hopefully deliver what people love about the form while innovating at the same time has been a hopefully successful part of my journey as a writer.
I agree. And yeah, I mean, really, this book was so thick with atmosphere, and all the characters were just really interesting to read, and the interactions were interesting to read. I think it was good. I mean, really, I really felt like I was kind of on a shelf watching all of this unfold. Super, super fun to read.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So, did you have a favorite character?
I mean, the character that I would want to hang out with the least was my favorite to write, which was Brittany.
Yeah, she was fun to read, but yeah, no, 100%. Like that. There's definitely the characters that you're just like, I enjoy reading you, but like in a real world setting, no way.
Oh yeah, she would just give me absolute heart palpitations to be in the same room with for more than 10 minutes. Social anxiety on max. But what I was saying about like the friction, somebody who's got a personality that is like go for the jugular and like always wants to dominate a space, in a female friendship dynamic, easy to create friction. Her just very existence in the room is friction. So it makes all the scenes that she's in really fun to write. She also gets the best lines, best dialogue. Being unself-aware allows a character to have just the best dialogue. So for me, that's really fun. And it makes it a lot simpler to write her because I always know where she's at because it's always on the outside of her. She's not going through this, self-analysis. She says what she means to wound people. I think for me, probably the hardest character would have been Paige, because she is existing in a large part in her relationship to Brittany, because their dynamic duo factor, she's like a bit the sidekick in the past, especially. It makes it harder to like pinpoint where she is on her own at a given time. So yeah, I think it's also really fun to write Vanessa, but she is a puzzle box. So that can make it tricky as well. I want to make sure I'm revealing the right parts and holding back the right parts.
Did you know what all the reveals were when you started writing the book, or did some of them sort of pop up as you were writing?
I knew the major reveals before. I will do I call it like extremely half-assed outlining. I used to be a full-on pantser and that failed me terribly.
I call this, and I've said this in a few interviews so far, I call that being a MacGyver writer now. I don't know why, like the pantser term bothers me. No offense to those who consider themselves pantsers, and no offense to those who don't know who MacGyver is. But basically, it's like, there's a bomb that's going to go off, and you just sort of have to figure out all the traps that are going to set it off, and also all the traps that can, all the things you can do to stop it and see if those things work. That's why I call it MacGyver writing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I will come up with, you'll see the major mile markers where it's like, you're a quarter of the way there, and this is what's going to happen to you. But a lot of the chapter by chapter, page by page reveals are things I realize in real time. Okay, I need something here that conveys this, or that throws doubt on that, and then I MacGyver it as I get there.
I love it so much. Well, thank you. Have you done any script writing, I have to ask? I think it's the last thing I sort of was thinking about while I was reading the book.
So yeah, I have. And the funny thing, and I will tell everyone, I hope that they hear this from me, I know that this is a terrible script because I have done enough script writing to know that I lived in LA for a few years. And so I don't think you can be a writer living in LA and not eventually write a script with some friends who are doing it professionally. The reasons that it is a terrible script are why it is a book. You're not supposed to tell every single tick. You're supposed to let actors and directors have creative license. Saying this is the way her eyes flicked, something like that is, wow, that is too controlling as a scriptwriter. But I am at least conversant enough with the form from working in it to, reproduce the rhythms of it, I hope.
Thank you so much. This is super fun. It was a super fun book to read. And it sounds like it was a super fun book to write.
It really was. And thank you so much. I love talking nerdy, like digging into the writing. It's my favorite.
Awesome. Well, check out Scenes of the Crime. It comes out on September 5th. So it will be out by the time this airs. So if you have not already, run to your library, your local indie bookstore, or any place you get your books, please do, and check out Scenes of the Crime. Jilly, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.